we've seen in the panel sessions today quite a lot of discussion and recognition of the global growth in data. And one of the things that's of interest, certainly the piece of work that we've done, is around this concept of benefit sharing. So it's quite a laudable principle. Any benefits derived from the use of genetic resources should be shared with Indigenous peoples and local communities. So the concept's quite simple, but implementation and execution has been quite challenging. And so we thought that given that there's been a huge amount of work done globally around policy implications and definitions around this space by various conventions, the UN Convention on Global Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol, there's probably half a dozen different conventions going on around the world that are looking at this, that recognise benefit sharing should take place, but there hasn't been a lot of work done in operational implementation of these concepts. So that seems to be the barrier at the moment, so we thought we'd make a little contribution into that space. So essentially this first piece of empirical research that we're going to present, we've been talking about data, we're going to present data to you, we're going to present real numbers, and some economic modelling that underpins all this, is really about starting to make an advance in this concept of operational, starting to help with operational implementation. So let's get into it. Okay, so we're waiting for our slides to come up on benefit sharing. I'll get started while we wait. So, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from access to genetic resources is a complex concept that underpins various international conventions. So despite the laudable principles, the concept remains in political deadlock. So there's this fundamental tension out there between the desire for quick and fast access to data to be able to do all sorts of innovation. You know, think of the COVID vaccine developments that went through there years ago, all due to the ability to be able to get quick access to sequence data. And the other tension is this desire for greater control of access so that, you know, Indigenous peoples and local communities can ensure that resources are appropriately used and benefits are appropriately shared, and that they have a role as custodians of biodiversity. It's a role they expect as custodians of biodiversity. So how do we manage this tension? And this tension's been the source of great political deadlock over the years. So a great example of how this tension plays out is digital sequence information. And digital sequence information is the RNA, DNA type data that's collected increasingly by many institutions these days. To move forward with operational implementation, we need to identify the areas where the majority of stakeholders agree. So if we can identify those areas where the majority of stakeholders agree, we can start to do some implementation in those spaces. We're not going to get as much pushback as we would in areas where there's huge disagreement. So a big aspect of what we're trying to do here is to measure what people prefer. And one way to measure that is to measure utility. Utility can help us understand what people value. In marketing, utility refers to how useful a product is. So marketers are quite interested in measuring utility to try and understand what drives your purchasing behaviour, for example. Once we measure utility, we can calculate what people are willing to pay for a unit change in a certain attribute. What we know about human choices, though, is that decisions are rarely based on a single attribute. So when was the last time you went to the shop and made a choice for a product based on a single attribute? Very rare. You consider a whole bunch of things. Where that item is in the shop, what brand it is, what price it is, what quality it is, what colour it is. There's a whole bunch of different attributes that all influence your choices that you make. And so techniques that are designed to identify what drives choice should take into account that multi-dimensional aspect of decision making. So our research questions are twofold. when accessing and using DSI on genetic resources, what combinations of data access and control mechanisms are preferred. So it's not one in isolation, it's the combination that matters. What amount of money are stakeholders willing to forfeit from their research budgets to use DSI on genetic resources as data access, consent and provenance changes? So the amount of money that you're going to give depends on what changes are made to consent, provenance and data access. They influence the amount of money you'd be prepared to share to support benefit sharing. So a very quick introduction to the type of technique. The type of technique is a very powerful technique called discrete choice modelling or stated preference, stated choice experiments. It recognises that individuals make choices by comparing and evaluating offerings at a holistic level. You need a design that can encapsulate that. You need to observe the way people respond to those different alternatives, and we can do that in hypothetical situations in what an experimental design can do. There's a theory that underpins this theory. It's called this particular technique. It's called random utility theory. It basically says that choices are based on the characteristics of the good, so your preferences for certain characteristics, but there's also a randomness in your preferences, and the modelling takes into account that randomness as well. So we develop a statistical model that can do that. So the first point to make is that you have to identify the attributes that are important, and we identify a conceptual model that has 4 attributes. The attributes are on the left there. The attributes are data integrity, data provenance, data access and cost. So then you need to define the attributes, as we do in the second column, and allocate levels to the different attributes. And when we do that, we can then manipulate those levels in a way that forces people to compare alternatives or variance in those different levels. And so you'll see that play out as we go through demonstration. So the scenario that's presented to a respondent when they did this experiment was that essentially, it's a bit small to read, but I'll just sort of spell it out, is that they're a biological-based researcher with a $5 million research grant. And we're interested in how much of that research grant they're prepared to allocate to benefit sharing.
And it was on Whakatōhea mussels.
Yes. Yes, so the genetic resource was green mussels. So, once again, this is hard for you guys to see. But we present different options where the attributes and the levels vary, and we ask people to make a choice which one they would prefer. And we repeat that several times so that we can garner the statistical data that we need to be able to use the analysis technique. So the sample that we used was individuals. We sampled 148 individuals. They made 1,623 choices in total that drive our improvement model. Approximately 82% of respondents were scientists. They all had experience. They all had experience also in research budget allocation, or the majority did. When asked what percentage of the total budget would you allocate to access and use DSI that relied on genetic resources and traditional knowledge, the mean score was 123,000 from the $5 million budget, which equates to basically 2.5% of that budget. 70% indicated that they'd give between 0 and 150, and approximately 15% thought they'd give more than 300. But these are very crude, simple measures. So we haven't done any real analysis yet, and so here's the analysis that we did. So the analysis was done in a tool called mixed logic, and the results obtained basically calculate the value, or what we call utility, for these different scores. So the stars over on the right mean they're statistically significant, which means that the values are unlikely to be due to simply to chance. So in simple terms. So that's important because that gives us confidence that these results hold. If we look at this quite simply, the first call is that things matter. Consent and provenance issues matter. So think about consent was for general use or specific use. Provenance was the known IPLC or known country of origin. What's important about utility scores too is that it's not the actual value itself that matters, it's the value relative to something else. So this is important because what's a 7 in a 1 to 10 point scale really mean? Well, it's somewhere high, but what do we really know unless we measure it relative to something else? So the way you interpret these results is that consent for general use is important relative to no consent at all. So if the option that I'm given is no consent, then that's not important here, but what is important is consent to general use. So it's always a relative score, and it's relative in terms of provenance to unknown country of origin. What's important here is known IPLC relative to unknown country of origin. So we can see here that people are prepared to allocate significant money if they know about consent and provenance. So the previous talk we're talking about ways to capture labels with regards to provenance. Previous talks this morning we're talking about consent. What this data is telling us here is that if you provide consent and provenance information, people are more likely to share more money, to give more, are more willing to pay more. They actually value consent and provenance information. And you can make more money through benefit sharing if you provide this data. Right? One of the interesting aspects of this first slide is that fully open access, which we would have thought would have been quite important, is not important. It's not statistically significant, and the values are almost meaningless, they're almost zero. Why is that the case? It's sort of a bit counterintuitive because we would expect open access to be great, highly appreciated and valued by the majority of respondents. So we did some more analysis, and we did some segmentation analysis, and what clearly comes out in the segment is that that particular category has two very clear segments to it that cancel out each other. So one group are interested in the negative value means that people prefer an Indigenous. In the first group, the negative value means that people prefer Indigenous repository over fully open access. The second group says that people prefer fully open access to an Indigenous repository. So the 1.51 is a positive, whereas the negative 0.8 is obviously negative. So this is saying that 73% of people prefer an Indigenous repository over fully open access, but there's another group that comprises 27% of people that just want open access and are prepared to pay a lot of money to get open access. So if we drill down in the results further, this is one of the advantages of the economic modelling is that it allows us to create a dashboard that's dynamic. So we can play around with different scenarios. We can adjust the levers on all these different attributes and adjust the levels and see how the graphs change. And the graphs are, one's Indigenous people and the other's non-Indigenous. And we can't play, I was hoping we could play with a lie, but we can't because of the way the system's set up. But essentially it allows us to also drill down on the roles that people play, whether you're a scientist, whether you're a policy advocate, whether you're a manager. So we can play around with different roles and see how that impacts the sort of choices that people prefer. And the choice here is that you choose option A over option B. So option A in this case had lots of known. There was consent, there was known IPLC, but a moderate budget, whereas the option 2 was no consent, unknown country of origin, etc. So we can manipulate those and see what happens there. So as a final wrap, this was a new modelling technique applied in this particular space. It's not previously been used to support benefit sharing. We show that the attributes that act, they don't act in isolation, they act in combination, and subtle changes in each of these combination of levels makes a difference in terms of what you're willing to pay. There's strong preference for consent and provenance. So if we can find ways to provide researchers and institutions with consent and provenance information, we're more likely to get them to pay greater amounts of money to, or forfeit greater amounts of their research budget towards benefit sharing. It helps us unpack that tension between fairly abstract terms like, you know, guys, we need to be as open as possible but as closed as necessary. So we can show with the simulated environment and the dashboard about how we can create different levels of openness and control. A limitation is that explaining all types of human activity theory, we're unable to be generalisable and at the same time have high precision and simplicity. So in this case, we've sacrificed breadth for depth. So our conceptual model only included 4 attributes. There may be other attributes. There more than likely are other attributes that would be interesting to test, like trust, like time it takes to get consent, etc. So there's a whole bunch of different attributes that could be used in the modelling. And the research is under review and hopefully we'll have it published before too long. Okay.
Kia ora koutou, I don't know how to get to
Oh, sheesh. Loud now. Okay. Oh, kia ora, ko Katie Lee Riddle, ahau, ko rongo whakātoa ki iwi. I've come to talk to you about our international work that we've been doing through TINT, through the data valuation section of the project. First of all, I wanted to get into the WIPO Treaty. So this is the Genetic Resources and Traditional Knowledge Treaty through the World Intellectual Property Organization. And before I get into the work that we've been doing, I'd like to kind of set the scene about what the current international legal landscape looks like. So under the new treaty that was open for signing last year, there is a clear need for documentation about the origins of the genetic material that you're using, as well as the origins of traditional knowledge that you're using when applying for a patent. Throughout these negotiations, we were really looking at the importance of provenance of data, among a whole bunch of other things. But provenance has become a really huge international hot topic lately, and we'll see that in the convention as well. For us, this means that when we have our origins disclosed, the origins of our knowledge, the origins of our resources, people who interact with that patent or interact with our information can see who they need to go and talk to have a further relationship, or if they want to ask questions or make use of the knowledge inside that patent. So really it provides a pathway for us as Indigenous people to assert greater control over information that's already out there in the world held about us. We also had our colleague who's in the room, Manu Keddy, come to the final meeting for this, and I really want to celebrate his hard work on this. We also had TPK in the house supporting us there, so a huge shout out to them. They worked really hard on this, and that's been a really big and interesting development in international law. What I'm personally here to talk to you about is the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this is an international treaty that was opened for signature in 1992, and it's an international convention, which means that every single country party has representatives there, and there are also industry representatives and there are Indigenous representatives, and the mandate of this convention is 3 things. They also are, first of all, looking at the conservation of biological diversity. Second, the sustainable use of biodiversity components. And lastly, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. And under that agreement is the Nagoya Protocol, which a few of us will be familiar with, which is particularly about access to benefit sharing, genetic resources, and Indigenous rights in those spaces. New Zealand is, however, not a signatory to the Nagoya Protocol. We are a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So any kind of rights that arise under this convention, we can rely on and say, well, you're a signatory to that. You need to hold yourself accountable. Anything that you agree to in this international space, you need to carry it and bring it home. So within this convention, there is the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. So as I said, there's the country parties, there are other stakeholders, so industry representatives, and then there is the International Indigenous Form of Biodiversity, the IIFB. And we are a collective of Indigenous representatives across the world. We apply to the Secretary to go, and we are there to represent our country, we're there to represent our Indigenous peoples specifically, and together we argue on behalf of Indigenous rights collectively, internationally. So we then separate into different working groups that tackle different topics, and the one that I was particularly involved in was the digital sequence negotiations, the digital sequence information negotiation. So that has been going on for the last 2 years, and I just want to show you the process on that currently. So digital sequence information, first of all, what is that? A quick reminder. So you have a genetic resource, you code it with a sequencing machine, out spits the genetic base pairs, so the ATCG code, that then sits in a database. And a researcher may use that code to run it in comparison to a code of interest to see what is interesting about this code of mine, what makes this plant unique, what are the components in it that make this particular active component effective, etc. So usually when a researcher is using DSI, they use it in an aggregate form, and a lot of the time there is not a lot of information about where this DSI is from or who's connected to it or whether they have the consent to use it. It is usually on an open form, free to access database that researchers can use. And they may not know the kind of origins of the DSI they're using, and so it's very hard to say, okay, well, how do I get consent from an Indigenous community to use this? It's very hard to tell. And as DSI is the genetic base pair representative of a genetic resource, under this international convention, it's not considered a genetic resource. Therefore, it's not currently subject to any of the other international regulations around a genetic resource. So what does this mean? It means that a researcher can use this DSI to their heart's desire, Wild West, grey area, no regulation, complete loopholes all around. We simply couldn't have that, and especially in this day with technology, as we become more advanced, there's less of a need for scientists to go out into the phenom and take a sample. They can simply find the DSI already online. So what this means is there's a huge lack of benefit sharing agreements with our communities. We're missing out on financial opportunities. We're missing out on having our tino rangatiratanga. We're not having our consent respected, and there's a whole mismatch between our relationship with researchers that can occur. So the CBD said at COP15 2 years ago, okay, this is obviously an issue. We need to create some provisions around this. And over the past 2 years, we've been working on what that will look like, and the gavel went down on the new instruments in October last year. Also, Manukati was there with me again for COP16, so there was 2 of us this time, and we've been working really hard on this. So as through TINT and through the project, we were able to go to the convention, and originally we were just there as supporters. We were just there to advocate on behalf of Māori and to help kind of do that community consultation side of things and really take our whakaaro and just go over there and really get ourselves heard. In the last 2 years, we've gone from strength to strength there, and it ended up that I became one of the lead negotiators for the IFB on DSI and co-lead of the working group there on DSI. So we've been working really hard as a team within the DSI negotiations, and so the things that came out on the other end under the gavel have been a reflection of a lot of hard work from our team. So here's what came out for DSI. All users of DSI are encouraged to share non-monetary benefits. So what does that mean? They have to share resources, they have to be able to do capacity building, and these are to the self-identified needs of Indigenous people. So a researcher wants to use DSI, maybe they don't know where it comes from, but they know that there is a community that they know of that they want to support, or there is a community that might be attached to this resource that they can go and say, hey, we want to give you some money to continue building schools, we want to give some jobs to your people, we want to give them scholarships, things like that. So all users of DSI should share non-monetary benefits. However, commercial users from industries that rely on DSI have to share a proportion of their profits or revenue, and it will be proportionate to the size of their business. So commercial use of DSI, you have to pay for that. Lastly, in recognition of our special relationship with the whenua as Indigenous people, they agreed that the majority of the funds that are generated from this benefit sharing regime should then go back to support grassroots community level projects about restoring biodiversity. Now, over the next 2 years, we're going to see how much money is actually generated from this fund and how much money can actually get back to communities, because it's around 80% that we're looking at for money to come back to Indigenous peoples, hopefully, but the reality is that it's at least 50% that's going to be coming back to our people, which is still a relatively large win considering how the negotiations are going. Now, for the negotiations, they weren't just about benefit sharing, they were about the ways that we engage with data and the relationship we have with it and the provisions around it. So there are a couple of things that databases have been encouraged to do as well about how they behave around DSI. So they have to make information about the benefit sharing regime publicly available, so all users of DSI know what they have to do. There's no, oh, I didn't know. You know what you have to do, the information is available. Next, anyone who submits DSI into the database has to be able to say that they have the right to do so, and they can show that, yes, I have consent for this data to go into this database in the first place. So no more sharing data without consent. Next, they have to or should comply with regulations and provisions around data governance. So that's fair, care, trust, and the UNESCO recommendation on open science. Now, if you're already familiar with fair and care, care is particularly important to us as Indigenous people because it talks about our Indigenous rights and relationships with the data. So they have to take that into consideration within their databases now. Lastly, they want to encourage the greater use of provenance metadata. So that's not just the country of origin for the data, but if you know the origin of the traditional knowledge that you're using in relation to the DSI, or you know the Indigenous community that this DSI comes from, then you should list it so that future users know who to go and talk to if they want to use it in the future. Now, I think, I don't want to preach to the converted too much, but I think we all know why provenance is important to us, right? We have a really deep connection to our whenua, and that connection should be respected and it should be visible to others to help them keep in mind that this is something precious to us, but also we would like to have a relationship with you about the research you're doing about our lands. It helps to operationalise fair and care, to know exactly where your data comes from. It helps you be able to use the local context labels that you've just heard about. And also, provenance, as I said, is being really highly discussed within WIPO as well. And so this global trend towards knowing where your data comes from is gaining momentum. And so the louder we can be about, hey, you need to recognise that this data comes from us, the more that they're going to hear us because it's becoming more loud and more insistent, which is a really great thing. So over the next few years, we're going to have a trial period of the fund and the mechanism. So there's going to be two different committees. One's a steering committee to say, well, this is how we think that the fund should run. This is the kind of projects we think are important. This is the other kind of things that are going on in the world that should be paid attention to as well. And then there's also the technical advisory group. So that's also really looking at all sorts of technical parts of the fund itself, you know, like how are we operating day to day, what kind of like financial stuff, you know, numbers. It's been very clear to me that during these negotiations, our Indigenous approach to DSI is really holistic in nature. And it's also about our perspective and our relationships to the whenua. And I wanted to close off this part, but I'll come and see you guys again with Tim and I swapping back and then swapping back again. But for this part, I just wanted to close off with a whakatauki that I shared at the UN. And that was Manaaki Whenua, Manaaki Tangata, Haere Whakamua. When we look after the people and we look after the land, we together can take care of the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.
No.
Okay, so this next project is also a way to build on the implementation of benefit sharing. But as the sort of title presents there, it's got that word compass in there. And what we're trying to do is help people to navigate contribution expectations by OPLCs, particularly with regards to the non-monetary benefits that Katie alluded to around the decisions made, and also the commercial use of DSI and the need to make a monetary contribution as well. So what we've done is come up with a serious game. And really, when we talk to companies, they really are very clear on the need that they they're looking for clear processes of engagement around this benefit sharing. It's a new concept. Researchers and companies are in the same boat. They want to reduce project risk, they want to establish predictable timelines, they want legal compliance, and they want to establish a reputation with local communities that is a bit like a social license to operate sort of concept. So they're quite keen on this sort of stuff, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to make that first step. So this game is designed to educate people on how to do that. You want? No. So it's a visual style narrative game. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because we're running out of time. Prior research has already, as we've discussed previously, already shown that consent and provenance matter, but rarely are we aware of how to navigate the different scenarios around benefit sharing. So we're going to present different scenarios and help people navigate. But it's also, most importantly, about designed to inform contribution expectations. What is appropriate behaviour in this particular space? Multimedia and gaming technology can be used effectively to educate and manage, to undertake research at the same time on policy issues like benefit sharing. The game's like a laboratory, you play the game, it's seen as an experiment, generates data that you can then run analysis through. It helps players establish and get confidence that they're on the right path towards appropriate behaviour and establishing a social licence to operate. There's three things that you need to do an effective, serious game. And that is, you've got to come up with an objective for the player, a narrative and a way to keep score. So we'll talk about those as we go. So the objectives are that benefit sharing initiatives differ in their ability to deliver results for Indigenous peoples, and we deliberately came up with three scenarios that are based on real life scenarios too, that are designed to help people understand. So the first scenario is you are leading a $500,000 research project investigating a mushroom fungus species with potential medicinal value. The mushroom only grows in a local region, so you can choose these different scenarios. The second one, scenario 2, is a nationwide community initiative. You have recently been awarded a $5 million research grant to advance bioactive seaweed research into agrochemical use. The seaweed's found in New Zealand, a Tonga species, and you will be required to work with multiple Indigenous communities. And the last one's a more international one, where we're looking at Kawakawa plant, and it involves various countries around the Pacific Rim. So the idea is to help people engage with these different communities and understand what are the expectations as they move forward. So as a player, you can pick one or all three in different, once you've gone through the game. You pick one, then you can go back and repeat yourself and play another game to understand about the bigger context. The narrative, research scientists seeking, first thing they've got to do is seek consent. So we help them understand how they can get consent by going through different communities or different groups. What's important here is that you get through the player goes through the process of consent, and there's various scores given as you move through depending on what choices you make. So we don't have time to go through all the different layers of the game, but you get scores for equity, you get scores for fairness, and you get scores for relationship value that are then aggregated as we move forward, and that's the next slide. The scoring system is if you are shown to be engaging at a high level with community representatives, then you can get a high score of 9, a medium score of 3, and a low score of 1. And they aggregate as you move through the game. The scores are aggregated, and you end up with an award at the end of the game. Gold tiki if you're doing the right thing, and you've engaged the local community all the way through. A bronze and silver tikis depending on the score that you end up with as you move forward. But to get, maybe the guys can just for 1 minute just show. If we're over, we'll stop.
Yeah, no, go.
To guys, can you pull the game up? And we can just show you quickly how it sort of, we'll go a third of the way through. So this is the start of the game, you begin, you get some discussion around what you're trying to do, Indigenous people's rarely experienced, commensurate economic value, blah blah blah. Individuals seeking to access and use digital sequence information on genetic resources are rarely aware of how to navigate different benefit sharing, so you get a bit of an explanation. Can we keep going? You've got to agree to participate. Yep, please push yes. Put your name in, whoever you are, as a game player, personalises the game as you move forward. Pick fungus for scenario 1. That's the one you picked. If it's a $500,000 project. Play scenario 1 again. You arrive at the Maui. Keep going. You move. The blue depicts the type of conversation that'll be taken off once the game goes live. It's just designed for our use at the moment. But a collaborative approach, you can see, I'm here with deep respect for your people and traditions, seeking permission to study Indigenous species. And there's different approaches, and depending on what approach you prefer, you get different scores for. So you can see how that goes. Maybe one more, and we're done now. I appreciate your efforts to gain consent. So there's dialogue as they go through, and then they go on to different types of data sharing and etc. And that goes through consent. And then as you proceed through the game, we're asking you to how much money you're prepared to allocate to non-monetary benefit sharing, and we put prices on internships, PhD scholarships, workshops, etc. So people get a feel for what they can get or what they can do with allocated budget for resource benefit sharing. Okay, thank you.
And I'm just going to kick off first with Larissa and the sovereignty of cultural images. So Larissa was helping us out a lot with Te Mana Raraunga, sort of doing some of the admin things around there, got really involved in the Māori data sovereignty space, and threw some money out there to try and pull some things together from some of the studies she'd done. So that's it. Cool.
Tēnā tātou, thank you all for being here. It's 4 in the afternoon. I'm hoping this little break got you a little bit more revitalised. We're going to be having drinks afterwards, so Maui's really kind of gotten that energy back into the room. Tēnā tātou, so he uri ahau no te rarawa nā koe Ngāti Pāwa me tainui hoki. I hail from the lovely northern Hokianga, all the way down to this beautiful whenua we stand on today. I'm just waiting for my slides. And so while we wait for my slides, I can run a little bit over the project. So I was a part of a border research project for my master's, and I ended up having lots of conversations with Maui around the sovereignty of some of the images that we used, and so that's kind of what led me here today. So, yeah, okay, that works, cool. So, visual inquiry and ethical research methods. So, visual research goes into lots of different kind of areas. You've got photo elicitation, photo voice, and so the way that we are using images today in regards to our research is really powerful. It's a great tool to communicate what a lot of our Māori communities aspire to. It's been used in lots of different types of research, so we've had a lot of homelessness research come out of Waikato University for a while there to show images of what living on the streets is like, and so all these kind of powerful uses of imagery kind of led me to think about the ethical kind of parts of our research methods. So whenever you kind of inquire to do ethics or to do research, you've got to go through ethics, and the ethics process is not always necessarily an easy process, but a lot of the time it makes us kind of confront our tikanga and leave our tikanga at the door to try and balance off a lot of the Western concepts around ethical procedures of research. And so it's been this kind of fun jumping game that I've had, and so I like to go institutional ethics versus relational ethics. And so I have this gorgeous quote from Rangatira Moana Jackson that kind of talks about this idea that to be objective is to actually divorce yourself from those whom you belong to. And I think that's really poignant when thinking about Māori research, because to think objectively about doing and engaging in Māori research, it's something that you come into with your heart, and a lot of Māori researchers know that to do research in these spaces, it's because you're passionate, it's because your heart's there. And so ethics is currently positioned to dictate what tikanga looks like in these spaces of research. And a lot of the time, you're having to fight for tikanga Māori in these spaces, and ethics can sometimes block that, and I've had a lot of frustrations with that idea. So in a lot of ethics spaces, you can't actually even frame your community as experts or holders of knowledge. They are participants. And it doesn't sit right with me because these people are experts that I'm coming to. So I thought about tikanga and the ways that tikanga has been talked about. So if you were to translate tikanga, it comes with that little bunch of list there, but if you were to define what tikanga is, you could come to a kaumātua and give you 40 different ways of defining what tikanga is. So I kind of defined it as this customary system of values and practices that we've developed over time that are deeply embedded in our social contexts. And what does this mean for research? So while Western research has created these customary systems of values and practices, not all the time are they aligning with our tikanga. So Māori approaches to tikanga. Oh, I'm going to go back one. So this is a 3-year project that I was a part of that was funded by the HRC, and the project was called Harnessing the Spark of Life, and it was led by Professor Terry Ann Clark, and we looked at how young people talked about how whanaungatanga supports their well-being. So engaging in whanaungatanga can look so different for so many of our rangatahi Māori. And so we asked 51 rangatahi from the far north all the way through to Waikato what whanaungatanga looked like in their everyday lives and what it means to them to engage in whanaungatanga. So we gave them all a tablet, and on this tablet they had a little video that kind of talked to them about ethical consent with the images that they were going to take. So we didn't really want to sit there and constrain what types of images that they were going to take. We let them take photos of whatever whanaungatanga meant to them, but we did say if you're going to take group photos, please ask permission from these groups. If you're going to take photos of these different places, just make sure that you've got that kind of consent there. And while most of the rangatahi did that, there are quite a lot of rangatahi who didn't. And so we had this giant data set full of all these incredibly beautiful images. But as we were going through the data sets and looking through the images, we had a lot of these images of things like whenua, which we thought was quite interesting because when we talk about whanaungatanga, we usually think tangata. But in this case, there were actually a lot of whenua images. There were images of urupa, there were images of wharenui, there were images in the wharekai, and we came to a point where we went, okay, some of these images, we're definitely going to need more than just this individual consent. And so we had a lot of conversations around IP and collective. And so where does the permission kind of lie? Is this consent enough? Do we think that we need more consent than what we've already gotten from the rangatahi? And so we would have wānanga, where we would kind of sit together and we would bring in a few of the images and go, how do we feel about these marae images? And so with images like of marae and of urupa, we kind of thought to ourselves, we need more consent than just this individual rangatahi's consent. And so we would consult with our rangatahi advisory group with the project, and we kind of ended up in this space where we asked lots of questions and not all of the time did we have answers. And so I want to talk about the fact that I don't have any answers here today. I'm not sharing any answers today. Instead, what I'm going to share is something that we kind of created, which is matapono, which are some touchstones to kind of engage in tikanga and visual research. So we have this really beautiful, brightly coloured image because I believe colours are great and I think all images should have colours, even if APA wants to try and limit you. So I've got all of our tikanga in this kind of space where these were the things that we thought about when looking at visual images. And so aroha, and a lot of this was holding aroha for our participants, a lot of this was holding aroha for some of the people who had passed away that they had taken photos of and that meant a lot to them. And so there was this big understanding that we have to always hold space for aroha for our participants, and in this case for our rangatahi. Whanangatanga was massive. Obviously we did a giant project on whanangatanga, so it was the centre, I think, the glue that binds us was something that we use quite often when talking about whanangatanga. So reinforcing that whanangatanga, what are these relationships between people and places and objects that are in these images? And how can we make sure that we uphold the mana, mauri, tapu, manapitanga? And so as we kind of go through them, I've just got questions. I don't have answers to the questions all the time, but I thought I'd put some of the questions up. So, maintaining aroha, holding aroha for participants. So, if a rangatahi had taken a photo of a loved one who had passed away, how do we gain consent for that image? Our loved ones who have passed away can't consent for that image, and it's something that we've talked about all day, is that there is not a lot of rights for our loved ones who have passed away. Was consent from the rangatahi sufficient sometimes, or should further permissions be sought? So a lot of the time when we had images of marae, we would talk about the fact that maybe we should not have these images because we're going to have to go to 8 different marae scattered across the motu and have hui with the marae committees and ask them, is this okay for us to disseminate in research? And so we kind of back and forth a lot in amongst our research group and decided we're actually just not going to utilise these images in dissemination of research. And a lot of the time we had these kind of thoughts of maybe we shouldn't be disseminating some of these images in research, and instead how do we uphold this image in a different way? And so we would talk about what do we do with consent forms, do all of our consent forms match up to these images in ways that we think through tikanga they should be, instead of just Western versions of institutional ethics. Considering Mauri and mana, also I will weave in between all of these kind of matapono because I feel like they are all very interwoven. So if you hear me kind of talking about something and you think, that's a little bit like Mauri, it probably is, because a lot of it kind of weaves through together. So we put mana and Mauri kind of in this similar area because it's this idea of Mauri, the relationship between the integrity of the image and the context it was taken in. So for that, we ended up creating a resource to disseminate through to our community. So we gave back to the rangatahi, we gave back to a lot of different youth spaces by creating 2 different resources. And so while we were creating these resources with these images, we were stylising them to give anonymity. So that's something that the institutional Western ethics was very stern about, was that young people, images, you have to maintain some form of anonymity. So how do we feel about blurring faces? In tikanga, it's something that I was very iffy about because the face is tapu. So how do we think about anonymity and maintaining the mana and the mauri of these images? And so we stylised them, but is stylising them also upholding the mauri of this image? And so, once again, I don't have answers, I just have questions, so please don't think I'm going to answer any of this really well. But should tamoko, carvings in the background, be blurred? So, there was some rangatahi who had tamoko. Do we blur the tamoko as well as the face? Questions, no answers. Please don't ask for answers. Recognising tapu. So, potential restrictions around the image and public dissemination. So, are the people, places or objects inherently tapu? And this had a lot to do with the urupa. So there were several images of urupa. So we were still trying to figure out ways to acknowledge the fact that urupa were really important for whanangatanga, for rangatahi Māori. So we would talk about it instead of using the images. So we were still able to give back the knowledge that was shared with us, but we were just not going to use the images that came with that. And so it's this idea of recognising that there are potential restrictions around these images and the public dissemination of these images. And so quite a lot of images came into this tapu space of, we are not going to disseminate these for research, but instead we have to really talk about these images when we are doing our analysis, when we are acknowledging that rangatahi had really important and powerful things to say about how they were connected to their marae. And so acknowledging that there were potential restrictions on a lot of these images helped us figure out different ways to instead elevate the kōrero. And so we just elevated the kōrero and we didn't put any of the images into those spaces. How am I going for time? I think I'm going all right. Supporting manaakitanga, collaborative approaches to the project. So how do we ensure youth are centred in the work we do? Rangatahi was this was about rangatahi. So not only did we have a rangatira advisory group, we had a rangatahi advisory group. And so we would come and meet with them, especially when it came to creating the resources to disseminate through to the community. And sometimes we would come in and be like, oh, we're going to nail this. These rangatahi are really going to enjoy what we've just put down. And I remember displaying something for them and then being like, oh no, I don't like what you said there. And being like, oh, okay, well, what would you put there? Oh, well, when I think about the word health, I think about a diet, so I don't think the word health should go there. Oh, okay, that's really good information to know. And so, supporting manaakitanga, we would show them certain images and go, do you think these images should be something that we should disseminate through to the community? And sometimes they'd be like, yeah, I don't know why you need to go back to my marae and get that image consented. I think it's fine. And then we would have to have that conversation of, well, I understand that you feel that your consent is fine enough for this image because this is your marae, but it's also lots of other people's marae. And so that idea of individual versus collective benefit kind of comes into play here. We still had to acknowledge that yes, this is your marae, but it's also lots of other people's marae. And so it was kind of like a upskilling in data solve with rangatahi without them kind of realising that's what we were doing. But yes, so how do we support whānau alongside youth? So a lot of this was incredibly collaborative, which was really great because it meant that we got to understand where the youth voice was actually coming from and actually acknowledge that youth voice was had throughout the entire project. But it also just meant that we got to learn that using health and rangatahi is not a great thing because they don't think that health is a great word. So yeah, manaakitanga was really beautiful. Reinforcing whanaungatanga. How can this project support rangatahi connections with their whānau? How did we know if we had good relationships with rangatahi? Sometimes it felt like they would sit there through our hui and they were like, oh yeah, when's lunch? And so we had to really kind of make sure that we were giving back. And so we would actually try and break it all into half sessions, and then we'd break it up with not just food, but we would go out to arcades afterwards. And so there's actually lots of images of us going off and playing games with rangatahi, and it was to make sure that we were actually reinforcing that idea of whanaungatanga, and it's not just us pillaging our rangatahi for information, but it was this really beautiful relationship that we still have to this day with several of them. And I think when looking at disseminating visual research, if you're not really invested and engaged with the group of people that you're doing this with, sometimes that can kind of come off in the way that you then disseminate those images. So I thought it was really important to reinforce whanaungatanga throughout the entire process because it meant that we had their feedback constantly on which images they felt were really important, which images they felt were really powerful, and then also the discussions of how those images get disseminated in research. Because there's a big difference between consenting to do a project because you get a cool tablet and you get to go off and take photos, and understanding what that actually means on the other end for researchers. And so if you're going to be doing visual imagery in your research, I think it's really important to uphold those ideas of collaborating in ways that we understand as Māori with tikanga. Do I have anything else? Please don't make me answer any of my questions. But if you have questions, I'm happy to kōrero. No?
Can you tell us a little bit, this idea of what is tapu and what is not? Some may argue that once you're in a digital realm, does tapu still exist or operate?
I would solidly say, yeah, it does, because I totally saw it in the way that images are a form of digital realm, and I thought there were some very tapu images that came through. We had a rangatahi who had gone on a trip, a field trip, to a site during the Māori Land Wars, and she'd taken a photo at that space with a tipa. And I thought that was a really beautiful image, and she had some incredible things to say about it. But I also acknowledged the fact that even in her kōrero about that image, she said, oh, this felt very tapu. And so I absolutely think in the digital realm that there is tapu.
So just kind of stretching it out a little bit.
Yeah.
So young people may not have the same restrictions in their thinking, in their ways of being. How do you not restrict their creativity or the exploration, but also help them be aware and considerate of these things?
I feel like that's what the entire project ended up doing. I think not even we knew at the beginning what it was going to look like. And so when we sent them out with the tablets, we said to them, take photos of your, I think we had some solid questions there of like, what does whanaungatanga mean to you? And how does it support your well-being? And can you take photos of how whanaungatanga supports your well-being? And we left it at that because we didn't want to restrict how they would take images, and then it did not. And I think that's when we went, oh, okay, we actually do need to go back and we do need to be having these conversations. And that's, I think, when having that constant engagement with rangatahi was really important, because that's when we got to have those kind of conversations of, yes, this is your marae, and yes, you did consent to this image, but actually there's more than just you that belong to this marae. So that's where then we were having those kind of conversations of, do you see how we need to talk to more than just you to ask for consent for this? And in some instances, it was things like some rangatahi had photos of like their rugby teams, and that was cool, but you got none of the permissions from any of the other players of your rugby team. And so it was navigating those conversations after the images had come through. So that way we didn't necessarily staunch and confine them into this box. So we let them kind of go free, but then afterwards we realised, oh, we did let you go free, and now we've got to kind of do some backtracking. And I think that's why I thought this was really important to talk about, because I've never known any form of research project that has gone through swimmingly, cleanly, and everything's happened perfectly. And I think it needs to be talked about a lot more, is that things don't go smoothly, and they didn't go smoothly, and this is why I've got lots of questions and no answers, because I think we had an incredible time doing this research, but there were lots of questions that came up as we were going through the data set, because we realised visual research is incredibly powerful, and it's an powerful tool for rangatahi to really express themselves, but it does come with things like, this feels very tapu, how do we uphold the mana, and all those kind of things. I hope that answered your question.
And now Katie can come back and carry on as well.
Yes. I'll keep it extra quick so that Maui can get into his kōrero. He's like, no. Okay, so I've come to talk to you about He Tapu Arahi. So these are the guidelines for protecting cultural intellectual property and research and innovation. They were funded through a SIFTI project that's been happening over the last 3 years. It's finished now, but this was the final output, and they're currently available for free where you've got your name tags. So there's enough for everyone. If you want to take one, please go ahead. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the whakapapa and what's inside the book. So how it started is that we did a literature review on all the intellectual property laws in New Zealand, and we just had a look at what kind of provisions there were for Māori within those laws. And we had a look and we felt that it wasn't a lot, which is also echoing what Linnell was saying this morning, that our intellectual property law is not necessarily equipped to deal with the cultural implications and navigations that we need for our knowledge and for our Mātauranga Māori. Next, we did a survey of all of the Crown research institutions and universities across New Zealand to see within your IP policies and within your policy in general, what provisions do you have for Mātauranga, what provisions do you have for our traditional knowledge and for cultural intellectual property. And this was a really interesting survey that we did, and there was a lot of range within the IP policies of these institutions. Some had really strong policy already in place, and some had none at all. And so we were saying to ourselves, okay, what do we need to do to help gain, to help raise the knowledge of the people around us who are engaging with these policies and writing these policies in the future? So we then had a Mātauranga Māori for Tonga species hui last year or the year before. Oh my gosh, time's flying so quickly. And we did a report on that, and basically we brought together a whole bunch of experts on commercialisation, utilisation of Tonga species, IP, etc., to have a conversation about these gaps and what needed to be done. What was then coming out of that was that we felt that the community members back home needed to have a resource for them that they could go to as a starting place to think, what kind of questions should we be asking in research relationships to help protect our Mātauranga and our cultural intellectual property? I forgot to do this slide. So these are a couple of the concepts that we've been trying to balance. We're trying to balance ownership with control, and access and use, and consent and governance. And when you're looking at the matrix of these 6 different concepts, you have rights versus interests, and shared versus exclusive, and where does community rights come into that versus individual rights, and how are we navigating all of these different tensions all at the same time. And so that's really what the book aims to do. And what's inside is that it starts with a legal landscape. So it says this is what the legal landscape is currently like, this is the situation, both nationally and domestic and internationally. And then also, what is the difference between cultural intellectual property and regular intellectual property? And then once we go from there, this is where we get into the kind of more substantive advice section. And we're looking at how do you create a fair and equitable research relationship? When you're creating an intellectual property plan, what kind of questions and aspects should you be covering? And same with the data management plan. And then after your project or research is finished, you should be looking at what other things should we be talking about. What about if we want to continue our research? What if there's something really interesting that we find? Or what if it goes all to hell and we don't want to work with you anymore and we need dispute resolution processes? What kind of things do we need to talk about within those kind of contracts to really manage those kind of outcomes? And then right at the end, we have a couple of useful appendices, such as a massive list of questions that you can ask through all of these stages. And it's really meant to be just a first step and a guide to help our communities to really start thinking about, I haven't thought about this aspect before, or what kind of concepts maybe be missing from our research relationships that we can really start to navigate and prepare for. So lastly, I just really wanted to thank those who have really helped out with the writing of this. We have Sifty, who funded this. We also have the team who worked on the book itself, so Natalie Q-Sabs, Maui Hudson, Regina Sterling, Mitchell Head, Wallace Oldham, Manu Caddy, and Linnell Tafari-Huria, and Katarina Ruckstill. So we have an abundance of copies available. Please take one, and thank you so much.
Yeah, so we've sort of gone over as we've been talking, so I'm going to sort of shorten this really right up. But one of the things that I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about some of the international impact that some of the activities that we've been doing through this part of the research project have had. And hopefully you've seen in the context of certainly Katie's talk, where they've been actively, directly involved in these sorts of international conversations. But often when you get involved in this sort of or found to get involved in the data sovereignty space, is there's things that are connected to other things that are connected to other things that are connected to other things. And when you try and get something going, there's something else that you need to work on to help it operate. And so there's been a whole range of different things that we've ended up getting involved with, partly through the project, and partly directly to the project and partly aligned to it. And I think we haven't really talked today about Te Mana Raraunga, but having Te Mana Raraunga there as an avenue to talk with people about issues that were coming up was a really important part of the journey as a whole. And so the fact that that is was re-energized again yesterday by Lara and Logan and everyone was, I think, a really great thing. Also, where it led into the establishment of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and the fact that we've been able to have this sort of international network now starting to advocate in a range of different places. And I showed earlier at the beginning of the afternoon, the conference, or the beginning of the day, the conference that's coming up at the end of March. Look, here it is here. So it'll be really interesting to kind of go. We haven't had one of these for a few years now, and so to go and find out what other sorts of things have been happening and moving along, I think is really important. I don't want to show my own picture as much as just talk about the care principles, and Katie mentioned that. And I think there's this wasn't this kind of interesting situation when we're trying to advance Māori aspirations, and at what times it's the treaty argument that can move things forward, when is it other sorts of arguments that are most useful. And in the current environment where a lot of things are being pushed back against Māori stuff, there's other things we might kind of lean to or point to help start getting things in place. And I think the care principles for Indigenous data governance is one of those things, because it's become embedded in a lot of the international policy spaces and international agreements. And so we can say, we're trying to do things to make it consistent with this as a little bit of a placeholder until we can be really upfront with the Māori dimension of our work. So it's been advanced in policy documents, and I'll show you a few of the activities that have happened around starting to operationalise it, and how do we move beyond just having, it's like, here's the values and the ideas about it, but this is how people are starting to utilise it in practice. And the care principles here, as they relate to collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility and ethics, have been translated into all these other different languages. So it's kind of interesting to get someone from a German context to say that we want to have this in German as well. Certainly the Spanish has been interesting, and I think as it's become a part of the sort of international discussions and dialogue around data governance generally, and become one of the kind of primary frameworks that's in use, it's been great to see it move out in that sort of way. And here's a range of different kind of documents that now reference the care principles, and Katie mentioned the UNESCO recommendation on open science. It just becomes different kind of places to show that while this was something that was developed maybe 5 years ago, it's really gained a lot of legitimacy around the world. And this, and the point is, a lot of the thinking around this came from researchers that were associated with the Tikanga Technology Project. And he had, really how we sort of think about and talk about where fear is focused on the characteristics of the data, and care focuses on the governance and use of the data, and then trust focuses on the digital stewardship and preservation. So they end up being kind of sort of, Andrew, did you get a picture? Can I move on here? Cool. And so there's these different projects around what sort of indicators need to be developed so that it can then be sort of measured in different places, or people can start doing audits. This is the project that's underway at the moment. We're collaborating with people at the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance in the US, who are primarily leading this project. And hopefully we should have something out in another year or so. also been interesting to see the different ways people have been thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty and or the key principles and writing about them in other contexts. And some of these are our mates, other Indigenous academics, but some of them are just other people that have sort of seen the idea and decided actually there's something really interesting in this, and this is how we're thinking about applying it. And particularly the one where you're starting here, where now people are starting to think, where does this fit in the context of technical solutions as well? And how could we make use of things like blockchain and smart contracts to operationalize it and make it effective? This is another project. There was actually supposed to be a conference at the end of this week in Washington, DC, which got nixed by the new administration. So, just kind of working out where that goes next. But, this was really all the publishers, so a whole bunch of journal publishers that are saying, okay, we need to be thinking more concretely about Indigenous data sovereignty or Indigenous data governance, and how can we integrate that into the processes that we have in place. And so there's written some guidelines for publishers around the key principles. So hopefully we can work out how to get this released in the next year as well. And this is starting to then kind of push out into these sort of different global networks and spaces where people are talking about. And Katie's already talked about the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and then some different places like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So that was the sort of the aggregated database, and you'll see there, if you can read those little numbers, they have like 3 billion occurrence records, because they get them from like about 4,000 or 5,000 different databases around the world, which they aggregate up. And there's a couple of things that's going on there. One, when we send data from New Zealand, from Landcare Research up there, that's where the labels drop off. And so they're going to change their infrastructure so that the labels can now be visualized on their platform. At the same time, they were really interested in what Landcare Research had done with using tribal boundaries as a filter. So you can go onto that and look at, say, all of the data that sits in the research on these databases, look at it by whakatohia, and it pulls them all up. Now, if you can now go up to this global biodiversity database, and I can look for whakatohia on that, and then see what information has been collected from all of these other institutions as well. And you're going, why would a French institution have something about whakatohia there? You'll be surprised. We did the exercise with Manaaki Whenua when we were doing a training for local context. We had people from Australia there. There was material from their community in the Landcare database, just because people collected things from different areas and have shared it. And it's really quite a common practice. So, I think there's this kind of different things that start happening where you try and make changes in both in those infrastructures to make it easier for communities to get access to their data, as well as doing the things where we're generating our own infrastructures so we can control and manage it that way. And I think we've done a pretty good job across the program as a whole of finding pieces of work to do across all of those areas. So I just want to say thanks very much to the team. Thanks very much to all of the people that have worked with us on things, there's been Whakatohia and others, for the kind of energy and ideas that they've brought into the program. And I will leave it there for the evening.